Well, good morning or good afternoon or good middle of the night for people around the world. This is our second session on March 16th as part of our Put Kids First Summit. We're going to be addressing all aspects of child sexual predation, what we can do to stop it, the lay of the land, and how important things are. Now, Rick, I'm getting really weird feedback. Do you have headphones there you might be able to use?
I do not.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll try to get past it, and I'll repeat whatever I have to. So Rick Lane, who's on this with me, is an extraordinary person. He is long known as a guide to big industry. He headed very senior roles for News Corp over the years, and he and I have been on opposite sides of arguments and on the same side of arguments. Rick, it's really pretty bad, and I don't think it's me because I'm.
Sure. Let me see if I can find something real quick. Okay.
Okay, good. I'll start alone while we search for technology. Good. So while we mute there. So we're going to be doing a lot of different things over the next 3 days. We started our first session on March 16th, but in Australia, in Brisbane. And so that was last night, Sunday night, New York time. So a lot of you are going to be able to participate live in these sessions in your own time zone. We're trying to keep them local to the speakers, except when we have a panel from Armenia, Ireland, Portugal, and New York. But other than that, we're really trying to address all of those. I'm going to unmute.
Oh, does that work?
Much better. Thank you so much.
There we go.
Okay, so we are going to be addressing this morning Section 230, which is a boring segment, except for the fact that it gives immunity to providers. It was designed in the time when they needed it. There were two laws that were having different support in the courts, and legislation came out that included censorship on the internet and added this little clause that no one ever really thought about. As the rest of the law was found unconstitutional, this provision was the only surviving section. It's called Section 230. And it's had a lot to do in the olden days of protecting networks from lawsuits in a very litigious society. But it's been expanded by the courts over the years, and it's had an opposite effect. It's no longer protecting anyone other than Facebook and some of the big providers. So Rick's going to talk about that, and he's in the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., and hopefully he'll give us more information about some of the new legislation we're seeing. So, Rick, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, tell us a little bit more about Section 230 and what you're seeing in the in forward-looking landscape.
Sure. Section 230, as you mentioned, Parry, was part of the 96 Telecommunications Act. And the goal was to try to incentivize back then bulletin board services and AOL to really clean up their site. It's part of the Communications Decency Act. So it really stemmed from two court cases, Prodigy and CompuServe. And one of the cases decided that bulletin board services should be treated like a publisher. So anything that was on their site, they would be held accountable for. And then another decision, the other decision treated them more like a book stand, that they can't be held responsible. And so they were trying to balance those two issues. So
Rick, I'm going to interject just for a second. There are a lot of people who don't understand the underlying basis for those. So under old English law, under defamation, you could be held liable as a publisher if a book or a publication that you issued had held defamatory speech. So they said that you have a financial stake in it, you have the ability to edit it, you can control what it says, and because of that, you are as liable as the author is. The other was, if you're a bookseller and you have thousands of books in your shop, you haven't read them, you don't have control over what they say, you don't know if it's real or not real, and your financial stake is a few pennies on each book, you can't be held liable for what's contained within those books if they defamed others. And they turned this, are you a bookseller or are you a publisher? Are you not liable or are you liable? Into what we do online. So the question is, are online publishers, in those days, AOL and CompuServe and Prodigy, are they booksellers or are they publishers? Yeah.
That is correct. And so there was sensible legislation. I was part of working that legislation to try to address those issues. But back then, the big argument, if you talk to people like Jill Lesser, Peter Harder, Jill Lesser was head of the AOL's government affairs policy team working on this issue. Peter Harder was the person in charge at Netscape working on these issues. And you go down the list, the big argument was that if we don't do the right thing, then people will go somewhere else. Because back then it was all basically subscription based. And so what happened though really was the change from subscription to targeted advertising. And that shift created an incentive not to be proactive in looking at what's going on your site. So those companies that were proactive had the safe harbor. And my view is that we should keep those safe harbors because we want to incentivize platforms to do the right thing.
Rick, could you explain the safe harbor itself?
Sure. The safe harbor gets back to this whole issue of being the publisher bookseller issue, which is that under the law previously, if you had knowledge that and you were looking and you found that there was like child pornography or something on your website, because now you have knowledge, you could have been held responsible for that. So the safe harbor said, if you're looking, you're doing the right thing, and you're taking down content or you're sending it to NCMEC as required by federal law, you cannot be held criminally or civilly liable for that. And that was a great thing. That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to create incentives so people wouldn't just turn a blind eye to what was happening on their site and just say, oh, well, nothing we can do about it. It's there. We don't care. We're not going to take any steps. We wanted to incentivize people. That was the goal. But then the other part of CDA 230 basically did say, if you do nothing and you don't have, and then you can't be held liable because there's nothing you can do. Your platform, you're totally off the hook. And that's what we're trying to change. And that's sort of the goal of any type of modification to Section 230 is to continue the incentive to be proactive, but also create incentive to actually be proactive.
Now, Rick, is this just a U.S. problem?
Well, the Section 230 is kind of used broadly around the world. And so that's sort of the question right now. What we tried to stop, a lot of us, including those engaged in the anti-human trafficking efforts, there were provisions in the United States Mexican-Canadian trade agreement that would have expanded or does expand Section 230 like language to those other countries. And there is an effort by Silicon Valley and others to expand it in all of our trade agreements and into the WTO. So there is an effort to expand these broad immunity provisions around the world. We've pushed back on that, and there's a lot of effort to stop that. But right now, it's pretty much a U.S. central legislation and law.
And there are laws that if you get a foreign judgment, that you'd be able to, under local laws, against the Facebooks of the world for failing to take something down or allowing some issues to continue, risks, radicalization, sex trafficking of children, that you can't enforce that judgment in the United States. So,
yeah, I mean, if there's a 230 protection does apply, but you are seeing jurisdictions around the world going after sites that are doing things differently than we have in the US. And that's why there was a strong effort by Silicon Valley and Google and Facebook and the others to expand it worldwide, because they did see the tide shifting where they were going to be held more accountable than they currently are. And that's sort of the conversation we're having here in the United States.
So I think that as people, who are not lawyers and not involved in the industry, look at this. They need to recognize that for whatever reason, at the time it was a good reason, we
Hmm.
gave immunity to an entire industry of internet providers. And we said if it's not your own content, even if it's monetized, even if you're making ads off of it, even if it's being promoted by you, if you didn't write it or pay somebody to write it, you're not liable for it. And there's nothing that anyone can do. They can't take you to court. They can't sue your officers. They can't demand that it comes down. They have absolute immunity. And if this had happened to the car industry, we'd still have Ford Pintos exploding on the streets. And often lawyers, because of these uh, product liability issues and the rest, can fix risks that whatever industry is ignoring, because they say that the risks are far less than the profits. And so we're going to continue doing what we're doing. And so we need to now turn around and say to the providers, you're no different from anybody else. If people walk in your door, you need to make sure they're not going to slip and fall. You're going to make sure that the elevators aren't going to snap while they're there, and that nothing sharp is going to get in the way. And it's time that we stop the sharps online.
Yeah, I think part of the issue the way we focus on it is really the conduct. Everyone talks about anytime you want to touch 230, the rhetoric is it's going to break the internet, hinder free speech, and stifle innovation, and harm small businesses. Right? That's the mantra on anything that's going to touch any type of tech platform liability issues. But the reality is that we're not talking about content. We're not talking about free speech. We're talking about conduct, and that's what we need to focus on is the conduct of the businesses. Are they taking the appropriate steps? As you mentioned, the car industry. Just because I'm a small business, I can't build a car that doesn't have brakes. I could be sued for that. Elon Musk, his Tesla had to have all the safety features, even though he was a startup, right? A tech startup. And so, we have to look at, are there incentives of how they're building products? Because right now, if you're in a room and at a platform, and you want to roll out a new feature on your site that is harmful, that can be used or misused or abused by bad people to do bad things, there is no legal incentive not to roll it out. There's every incentive to roll it out, because if it helps create your business and it makes your business stronger and more sticky, then you roll it out, because your lawyers are saying you can't be held accountable for that product and that feature, and the business guys are saying we can make more money off of it. You can't do that if you look at any other business out there. I can't build a product say, I know all these harms. We've had conversations about the harms, but I can go ahead and roll it out because no one can sue me. And that's sort of the conduct area. Or if you're profiting off of illegal behavior. And that gets into, like, for example, if I wanted to create a revenge porn site and I say, okay, I'm going to have subscription based, I'm going to have, most likely not advertising, but it'd be subscription based, and you can upload all the bad stuff that you want, things that are horrible, of your spouse, your whatever it is,
Your ex-spouse.
your ex-spouse, yeah, exactly, or however you want to do it. Then I could do that as long as I'm not the one creating the content, right? I am a platform. It's a third party. Go after the third parties. And that's just not the world we want to be in. We need to have guardrails to ensure that these companies are doing the right thing, because just like in the chemical industry, we don't allow them to just spew chemicals into rivers today. It does hurt their business. It costs them more money, but it also has greater harm. Even though there's all these great things that the chemical companies have invented and make our lives easier and better, those are all wonderful, but we still don't allow the bad stuff to happen. And so for all the great things that happen online, there are a lot of bad things that happen online, and we all need to work together. But right now, there's no legal incentive for them to take those appropriate steps.
Would you talk a little bit about FOSTA and SESTA?
Mm-hmm. Sure, happy to. So getting back to conduct, the purpose of FOSTA SESTA was to give local law enforcement and survivors the legal tools to go after websites that were knowingly facilitating sex trafficking. Now, you'd think that, oh my gosh, of course they can go after these sites. The reality was they couldn't. The case was Backpage.com. And Backpage.com was a site that basically most people knew were selling young girls online for sex. And so when the state AGs wanted to go after them, and the survivors wanted to go after Backpage.com, they were stopped at the courthouse steps because of Section 230. And so that created this incentive. So the survivors and the AGs came to Congress and said, you have to fix this. This is a huge problem. The judges are stopping us. We can't even figure out if they're doing something illegal. So the Senate Oversight Committee did an investigation into Backpage.com, found about all these horrible harms that they were doing. And they ended up shutting it down under federal law. But and that's what the other side likes to point to. Oh, well, there's federal criminal statutes, and Backpage.com was shut down before FOSTA SESTA was enacted. But the reality is that FOSTA SESTA had nothing to do with federal criminal law. It was about giving state and local law enforcement the legal tools and survivors. And now that's on the books, even though it's in court right now. And groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and others are funding millions of dollars to try to fight it. It is now the law of the land. And so that's where we get to engage in conduct and seeing if you can make sure that the local and state law enforcement have the legal tools.
Now, 230 has always been sort of the sacred cow. And there's a great deal of money that's gone into elected officials' campaigns from Silicon Valley and a lot of the tech stakeholders to make sure that they are not held liable for whatever's going on their networks. And some are legitimate arguments. It's hard for them to see everything. But certainly if we put in a notice test at minimum, we turn around and say, if you've been notified, that may be something. We're going to be talking to John Edwards later today on his reaction on the New Zealand massacre and what he called the morally bankrupt industry who didn't seem to care. Is this a matter of care, or is this a matter of profits? And do you think Congress is now ready to do something about it?
Yeah, I guess maybe because I would say I'm a recovering lobbyist. It's not about the money. If it was, then there wouldn't be any lobbyists because you'd just be able to write checks. I work for Rupert Murdoch, who's a billionaire. So you have to have the arguments, and the arguments the other side had were legit. That is going to increase liability. That's a known fact. And when Congress was looking and talking about these issues in the past, there was a lot of unknowns. It was new. We didn't know what the future was going to hold. But now we do. And I think that's the big change. I think the techlash has really occurred, starting, I think, with the SOPA PIPA fight. And we can have a conversation on that at some point. It's a longer conversation. But I think members of Congress are realizing that the status quo is not acceptable. And I think you heard that clearly from Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal at the Senate hearing last week. They're just saying enough is enough. We are not going to accept your excuses, and we are going to take steps to hold you more accountable. And I think it's sort of the frustration. And I think that's why there's a lot of people like myself who are free market. I worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as their first director of e-commerce and internet technology policy. I don't like over regulation by the government. I don't like handing trial lawyers, a blank check. But we begged and pleaded. We set up a system for these internet companies on privacy, on all these issues to create an amazing self-regulatory environment to really try this as an experiment for those of us who believe in less government involved in businesses. And they failed. They've taken advantage of it on the privacy side, on the cybersecurity side, on the safety side, and they're just not doing that we had all hoped that they would do. And so Congress is waking up. It's bipartisan. Having Lindsey Graham working with Dick Blumenthal, this is it. This is it. There's no other issue.
Very strange bedfellows.
Yeah, or you have Senator Cruz praising Speaker Pelosi. There's no other area where this is happening. And so if I was the other side, I'd be very nervous because there's agreement that there's more that can be done. And saying that, oh, you're going to break the internet, stifle innovation, hinder free speech, and harm small businesses is just not selling anymore. Because everyone's seeing the harm. They're not buying it anymore. And I think a lot of members feel that they've been misled that they're giving as we would say, the Heisman by these tech companies. And I think Speaker Pelosi, I felt that way with the video that slowed her down. I think, my view is that what changed in Speaker Pelosi's mind because of that was that, here I am, the Speaker of the House, one of the most powerful people in the world, and I'm begging a company to do the right thing. And if they don't want to do the right thing, then there's nothing I can do. And so for her, she's thinking, well, if I'm powerless, imagine the ordinary citizen. How powerless are they against these companies? And I think that's what's turning the tide. I think people are finally seeing the harmful ramifications, and they're saying these tech companies haven't stepped up to the plate. And so therefore, Congress is going to do what Congress is supposed to do, which is to protect citizens and the broader community.
So we're going to try to get a digital version of the hearings. I've been locked in my house in New Jersey by my husband because I'm old and have diabetes, and he doesn't want me to die. So we don't have any
Barry.
Yeah, thank you very much. We don't have any toilet paper, and I've streamed everything I could possibly stream. But could you explain the new bill and what it proposes to do?
Sure. So it's the Earn It Act. The Earn It Act was introduced by Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal, with now I think it's up to 11 additional co-sponsors in the Senate. This stems from the frustration on the whole issue of child sex exploitation. They're changing. I agree. They're changing it instead of saying child pornography, it's child exploitation, because they're continuously exploited after. It's not just the one time when the horrible events occur. It really is the ongoing abuse when every time a photo is exchanged. And so the members felt that the platforms weren't doing enough, that they needed to step up. And so they introduced a bill that's very targeted in this one area. And the bill basically creates a commission. And that commission will make recommendations on best practices. And then those best practices are then sent to Congress for approval. And if those best practices are not followed by companies, then they can lose their Section 230 immunity protections. And so it's obviously under vicious attack by groups like NetChoice and others on how it's a backdoor to encryption, how it's going to make it harder for law enforcement because entities are going to go underground and harder to find child pornography. And then there's this whole Fourth Amendment argument that it is going to be determined that the platforms are acting as agents of the state, and therefore the evidence could be thrown out, and it's on and on and on. And it's going to break the internet, stifle innovation, hinder free speech. So you always have to add that at the end of all of these. So that's sort of the backlash is coming from Silicon Valley. What Senator Graham said was very simple. He said, "We're doing this. Either this or we'll just get rid of all 230. Kind of your choice. You haven't come up with a better plan." And so I think that the reality is that this legislation has a really good shot at passing. I think the only negative that I personally have about it is that it's not broad enough. That there are a lot of other things happening online that also should fall under this sort of regime, but that's fine. I'm a campy one since I helped get FOSTA SESTA through to say you shouldn't do it piecemeal. But I do think that it's a good start. It's a great conversation to have. And if this is all that can be done in this next session, then that's it. But that it's not anything bad with the legislation. I just think there are other parts that need to be addressed. But again, that's a policy call.
Were you at MySpace yet when we had the internet ISTTF, Internet Safety Technology Task Force out of Harvard? Because Blumenthal was heavily involved. I think that was just before you got there. And they were Hamu was involved at the time,
Well,
and
then I had to be because I
yeah.
hired Hamu.
Okay. So there were 28 or 29 of us who were
Right.
appointed, and I know Blumenthal was an
Yeah.
advocate for making sure that I was going to be part of it. He was still an attorney general and was very upset over a lot of the things that were going on online. And Lindsey Graham is passionate about a lot of things, whether you agree with all of them or not. In this case, I think it's such an important bill, and everyone, if you have children, or you're thinking about having children, or if you were ever a child, I think that we need to make sure that laws are in place. Now, that's a personal statement. We're a 501c3, so I'm not lobbying. If I did, I'd have enough money to fund the charity forever. But this is important stuff, and a lot of people don't understand it because of all of the fake news that's out there and all of the other issues that are going on. People aren't paying attention to the fact that whatever happens to their child, they have no recourse for. How do you go up against a company the size of Facebook when they've got lawyers everywhere who are going to shut you down? You file a lawsuit, you walk into court, the judge says, sorry, dismissed, go home. You have no rights here. And it's time that we start taking back rights to users.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I said, that's why I would highly recommend people read the legislation. I kind of laughed when I heard this Fourth Amendment argument, which is that, the evidence, because there was a court case against NCMEC that was the defendants are claiming that these sites are acting as agents of the state. No evidence has been thrown out because of that at this point. But I am going to take my cue from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who
Good
read
point.
this and said that in their view, there are no Fourth Amendment problems, versus NetChoice, who is in Silicon Valley saying, oh, there's all these Fourth Amendment issues, and therefore we shouldn't enact it. I'm sorry, I'm going to throw my hat with NCMEC, because this is what they do. Their goal is to protect children. And you have this pushback from the Internet Association saying that, oh my gosh, this is going to allow people engaged in child exploitation to get off free. I'll go with NCMEC. That's my view.
Okay, so I'm going to do some translation. NCMEC is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They are the people who you call if your child is missing. And since 1996, I think, December 2nd, the cyber tip line was set up by Janet Reno's legislation saying there's a safe harbor if you report things and you do things you need to, if you find images of child sexual exploitation online. You were also talking about the Fourth Amendment. Would you explain what the Fourth Amendment is for those of us who, I read the Constitution, but for others who may not know?
Well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so that's why I'm throwing my hat behind NCMEC and their general counsel.
And I'm a lawyer.
But the Fourth Amendment is, first of all, the legal search and seizure. That says that government can't come in and just, without a warrant, just grab stuff and use it as evidence. But there's also this other provision, and the way it's interpreted, that you can't, if it's illegal for the government to do it, you can't ask the private sector to do it on your behalf. And so that's really where the question comes into, is that they're arguing that because that you're having these entities, private sector entities involved in finding this stuff and having this best practices, that somehow they're acting as an agent of the state. But the other thing just to know, Parry, is that you are required by law. It's not voluntary. It's not that you just have a safe harbor to send it. That was actually came after the law itself, and I helped fix that, because at one point you're required by law to send any image that you think is. It's not that but if you think it's child pornography and and you have to send it to NCMEC. The problem was that it was also illegal to send child pornography online. So we actually had to fix it so that if you are sending it to NCMEC, that's okay. But you're required by law. So if the argument of the Internet Association is that they're already acting, that somehow they're acting as agents because they're engaged in these activities and helping law enforcement, then are they saying they shouldn't be sending these pictures of children now because they're doing it and it's required by law. Is that a Fourth Amendment violation? I hope that's not what they're arguing.
Well, I hope they're not either. And when you're seeing a lot of this agents of law enforcement and government, you see a lot of that with entrapment. So
Mm-hmm.
that if volunteer groups or others are working closely with law enforcement and they go undercover, pretending to be a child, is that entrapment? If because they're
Mm-hmm.
working closely with law enforcement and therefore subject to search and seizure laws, or are they independent enough and just reporting it? And I think, we look at those and they're going to be people. I love Nick Mick, but I think we can actually find some lawyers who are going to comment on whether they're government agents for the purposes of search and seizure and the protection we have against law enforcement doing things that regular people can.
Well, Mary Larry, in her testimony at the Senate hearing, addressed that Fourth Amendment issue herself. And she's a well-respected lawyer from Catholic University who focuses on these issues. So it wasn't just the National Center saying it, but it's also other lawyers saying it.
I
Again,
wasn't
it's,
I wasn't criticizing. I just
yeah,
think we need our own panel of lawyers who can turn around and say, you know,
absolutely.
this stuff is fake news and garbage, and just because you have more money than we do and control the platforms doesn't mean that you're right. And I think
Right.
we're looking now at a time when people are trying to take back some of the power that we gave to others. Couple questions,
Sure.
and we're a minute over, but number one, you and I both stood together in many cases, sometimes on opposite sides, but we stood up to protect the industry in the very early days.
Mm-hmm.
So Section 230 was 1996. The problems were arising in 1995 and earlier on the cases and
Yeah.
Prodigy and CompuServe. And we all stood up saying, no, we don't want legislation. You can handle this. We trust the industry. And then we found out that much of that trust was misplaced. Should we be blaming ourselves too for being complacent and trusting, and perhaps we should have been more vigilant?
Well, I don't think we can blame ourselves because, I mean, there are a lot of positives that's happened, right? I'm not saying that everything was negative. So there was a lot of positive. And we try to put it into a structure. I think what really transpired was, again, this change of business model and younger companies coming in, not understanding the deal that was cut. That you're supposed to be proactive. This wasn't a free for all. This wasn't a free get out of jail card for the platforms. It was supposed to incentivize. And so I would say that we gave it a shot. We really built a legal structure that allowed them to do the right thing and make money. Unfortunately, what they did is they just made money.
Yeah.
And they haven't taken the step. So now it's time for those of us who were there in the early days, who worked hard to try to create this legal infrastructure to provide a broad, swath of ability to do right, and say, okay, you screwed up. It's sort of like when you have children, right? And you give your kids leeway to do the right thing. And if they don't do the right thing, then you have to start placing more and more restrictions on them to keep them within the guardrails. And we started off, again, there are laws on the books. You also had court decisions that broadened what we had put in place.
Yeah. Totally
Both on this
unintended.
and everything else on platform liability issues. And so we need to bring those guardrails, closer and closer in. We have to, take steps as adults to correct those who are not doing what we had intended them to do when we created this this legal platform.
Last night in New York Time, I spoke with John Rouse, who is one of the leading law enforcement agents in the world on child sexual exploitation online. And he heads everything out of Australia. And if you know what you're talking about, you need to make sure he's always at the table. And he looked at me and he said, Parry, together, he said, we took our eye off the ball. And maybe I will take blame. I don't think you need to. This wasn't your area. Your area was making sure that all of the principles worked and the frameworks were in place. And mine was always, how do we protect children, which at the time also included giving them access to this extraordinary technology that allowed them to connect with the world. And John and I and a number of the others trusted industry. And we knew people within them. They were people we would call on a daily basis or use AOL's instant messenger to talk to.
Mhm.
And a lot of the people I trusted aren't there anymore. And a lot of the newer players are in there just for the profits, not the benefit. And so
Well,
I'll take blame for that one. And I know John's taking it too. And it's time that we turn around and say, we were wrong. We set parameters for our children. They broke the rules and we didn't enforce them until it was too late. That's our fault. So I love that you're stepping into child protection. It's an area you didn't do in those days.
well, I did though. I mean,
Oh,
here's
okay.
where I take that. This is where I take pride. And when
I
we
wasn't
bought,
aware of it. So,
yeah, when we bought MySpace, I was the point person to make sure that we cleaned up MySpace. I put together meetings before the AGs sent their letters, Blumenthal and Cooper, to MySpace. So I said, we have a problem here. And when I first started the meeting, it was sort of, a few people. By the time the meeting was going to happen, we had received our first two letters because I had seen it coming. And also I had, a son who was at that age who's going to be on MySpace. I had nephew and nieces on MySpace. And so I took it upon myself and hiring folks and bringing folks in to make MySpace safer. When we first started MySpace, there was a state AG who said that MySpace was a smorgasbord for sexual predators.
mm,
And by the time we were done with MySpace, he said we were the gold standard. And we took pride. Every decision that we made, when we would sit down with our team, we went through the checks. We did not roll out certain functions and features of MySpace that we could have, made us very sticky, because we couldn't figure out how to make it safe for our users and our younger users. So we took active steps. That's why I'm working closely with the National Center now, is because I would literally call them almost every day and say, what can we do to make MySpace safer? What is going on out there, and what steps and what can we implement? So we took it very seriously, and we took it seriously not just because of myself, but because the leadership at the top, Rupert and the team at News Corp, wanted to make MySpace safer. And that's what it takes. And we used to say to the state AGs, we had over 50 state AGs, 51, because there's, the District of Columbia, looking at MySpace. And, what we kept saying is, we're doing all these incredible steps. What about Facebook? We kept asking them, and Blumenthal said to us, well, they're small. They'll
yeah,
follow
they
your
were
lead.
they were 8 million at the time. MySpace was 50 million in
Right.
June of.
And the other thing that they remember, what Facebook would say is, oh, we're .edu. We don't allow anybody with a .com email address. That's why we're safer. Because no one with a .edu ever was a sexual predator. I just say, but we were seeing what was going on to those sites. We saw the bad stuff happening because we were looking. And we would let the state AGs, here's what's going on. And they said, oh, we'll get to them later. MySpace is what we're going to focus on. And we're like, look at all the stuff we're doing, which is why they never did anything, legally against us, because we took the steps. But they ignored Facebook. And so anyone I blame is really, and I'm glad that Senator Blumenthal is taking steps now to clean it up, because we told him this. We warned this. So this is not new to MySpace. We told Chris Kelly, we were yelling at Chris when he was the general counsel of Facebook back then. You guys got to clean up your site. And he's like, we're moving fast and breaking things. So, you're on your own, guys. And so now, so that's why I don't take blame, because if you did it right and we had the tools, we were cleaning things up. But my view is that the failure came when we were telling back in 2006 and 7 and 8 that they needed to watch what was happening on platforms like Facebook and others, that that the elected officials didn't stand up and take cert. And so now we're all paying for that now.
I think we are. And I predated you with MySpace. I started working with Krista Wolf in January of 2005, when Bob Sullivan, who was then with MSNBC, and his sister was one of my Tween Angel chapter directors, called me saying that his niece, who was then 13, who went to a kids' Catholic school, and her mom was one of my directors, had been she set up an account on MySpace, and it had her name, address, and pictures, and how awful that was. And I said, oh, don't worry about MySpace. It's for independent musicians 18 to 24, not an issue. And then the world exploded when I called and threatened MySpace and found out that Tom's best friend, who was a mortgage lawyer, was the one who was general counsel to MySpace. And I threatened them, and then they said, well, tell us how to fix it. And that's when my life changed. I lost 2,000 volunteers who said, you can't work with social networkers because they're putting our children at risk. And the world has changed. But
and that's why I sat on all the task force. I traveled around Virginia to educate parents on how to be safe on MySpace. So I put a lot of time and resources because, again, I look at it as it was my own kids and my nephew and nieces that were on there. And every day I thought, how can I make it safer for them and their friends and the broader community? And we did take those steps, and I'm very proud of the steps we took.
And I think that so much has happened over the years that what I saw you were doing is making the industry better, and what I was doing was protecting kids. Really, were the same thing.
Absolutely.
And
I always relied on your advice as well, Parry. I mean, that's how we worked. We were always open and trying to figure out the best way to make it a safer, better place. Unfortunately, others did not follow.
Well, you always made me smarter. Anytime I had questions over the years, it's like, wait a minute, I've got to call Rick. He'll explain this. So I'm thrilled that you're doing this. I'm thrilled that you're going to be helping us as we go forward, trying to set up some standards here on cyber
Absolutely.
safety, and that you're always at the end of a cell phone call when I need help.
Anytime.
Any questions or comments you want me to relay to John when he gets on the call?
No, I think you know all the questions.
I really like him. I just do. And I think, when you get a privacy commissioner from a country that cares about kids as much as he does and doing what's right, that they're from New Zealand.
Right.
They're like Texans. You don't get in their way. So thank you so much, Rick. I really
happy to do this.
It. And
anytime.
you're doing wonderful work. And one of these days we've got to get down and let Nick know how much we love them. Michelle is one of my favorite people. John has been doing extraordinary work.
Absolutely.
And so they've got a couple of awards coming. I know that things are busy with coronavirus, and now we're seeing kids even more at risk because they're home, parents aren't watching, and the kids are connected 24/7. So we're seeing the bad guys use this as a way to get to our kids. So who knew?
Absolutely.
All right. I love you very much. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Parry.
I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye.